So there's this moment on the night of July 31st, 1943, over the Taman Peninsula near Novorossiysk, when everything just stops. The anti-aircraft batteries had been firing all evening, flashes of orange and white lighting up the summer darkness like some hellish 4th of July display. But then, around 11 o'clock, the guns went silent. Just quiet. Which is incredibly strange because these German positions had been hammered night after night by Soviet bombers, and silence meant something was wrong. Senior Lieutenant Serafima Amasova, deputy commander of the 508th Night Bomber Regiment, was leading her squadron toward the target that night. She was 23 years old, a former Aeroflot airline pilot who'd flown commercial routes before the war, and she knew something was off. You don't just stop shooting when enemy bombers are overhead unless you're planning something else. Her Polikarpov Po-2 biplane, basically a wood and canvas crop duster from 1928, held together with hope and Soviet determination, rattled through the darkness at maybe 90 miles per hour. Behind her sat her navigator, tucked into the rear cockpit with her maps and bombs. They'd already made 3 runs that night. Each plane could only carry 2 bombs, one under each wing, so they just kept going back and forth, like deadly delivery drivers. Then the flares went up. Green rockets shot into the sky, bathing everything in this sick phosphorescent glow. The anti-aircraft guns stayed silent, and that's when Amasova saw it, a shadow, fast and predatory, cutting through the formation like a shark through a school of fish. A Messerschmitt Bf-110. The first Po-2 erupted into flames. Just exploded, really, because these planes were made of plywood covered in fabric that had been painted with aircraft dope, basically highly flammable varnish. One tracer round and you became a flying torch. The second plane followed, then the third, then the fourth, 4 planes, 8 women, all of them burning alive against the night sky, falling like dying stars into the Russian steppe below. Amasova could only watch. What do you do when your friends are being picked off one by one and you're flying a plane with no guns, no armor, no parachute, and no way to outrun the hunter? You scatter, you run, you try to make it home. The surviving crews broke formation and fled into the darkness. For the first time since the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had deployed to the front lines in June 1942, they were grounded for an entire night. The Germans had finally figured out how to stop the women they called the Nachthexen, the night witches. So here's what we know about what happened that night, pieced together from Soviet military records, German Luftwaffe documentation, and the testimonies of survivors who lived to tell the story. The hunter's name was Oberfeldwebel Josef Kotyok. He was 25 years old, a career Luftwaffe pilot with 10 Korps Zerstörer 1, a night fighter squadron stationed in the Crimea, and my God, he was good at his job. By July 1943, Kotyok had racked up 27 aerial victories, many of them at night, which is incredibly difficult. Shooting down planes in the dark is like trying to hit a moving target while blindfolded. You need instinct, patience, and a lot of luck. But Kotyok had developed a specific hunting technique for the Po-2s. See, these little biplanes had one advantage that made them nearly impossible for most German fighters to shoot down. They were too slow. A Messerschmitt Bf-109's stall speed, the speed at which it literally falls out of the sky, was faster than the Po-2's maximum speed. German fighters would zoom past these little planes, unable to slow down enough to line up a shot without stalling and crashing themselves. The Bf-110, though? Twin-engine heavy fighter, more stable, slower, and absolutely bristling with firepower. 4 7.92mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons in the nose, plus additional machine guns in the rear. A 1-second burst threw over 4 pounds of metal and explosives downrange at twice the speed of sound. It was enough to disintegrate a Po-2 instantly. Kotyok had been tracking the Night Witches for weeks. He'd studied their patterns, their approach vectors, their tactics. The women flew in groups of 3. 2 planes would draw the searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, while the third idled its engine and glided silently over the target to drop its bombs. That's where the witch's broom sound came from. The wind whistling through the canvas-covered wooden struts sounded like something supernatural sweeping through the darkness. On the night of July 31, 1943, Kosiak coordinated with the ground batteries. They fired green signal flares and went silent, giving him a clear field of fire. Then he positioned himself perfectly, high enough to dive on his targets, close enough that he couldn't miss. He lined up his first victim and pressed the firing button. The pilot was Yevgenia Krutova. Her navigator was Yelena Salikova. Both women were in their early 20s. The PO-2 exploded in flames and tumbled toward the earth, trailing fire and smoke. Kosiak banked hard, lining up his second shot. This was Anna Vysotskaya and Galina Dokutovich. Same result. A single burst, instant disintegration. 2 more young women burning alive. Third plane, Yevgenia Suhorukova and Alexandra Rogova. The Bf-110 skimmed along the bomber line like death itself, and they didn't even have time to react. Cannon fire, flames, falling. Fourth plane, Valentina Polunina and Glafira Kashirina. Kashirina had been a Moscow State University student before the war, an instructor at one of the capital's flying clubs. She'd flown bombing missions over the Mius River, the Seversky Donets, the Don River, all around Stavropol. She'd survived more than a year of this brutal, grinding war, and in less than a minute, she and Polunina were gone. 4 planes, 8 women, 11 seconds. The German military. Command awarded Kosiak the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross that very day, July 31, 1943. They called him Hexenjäger, the witch hunter. He'd done what no other German pilot had managed to do. He'd grounded the entire regiment for a night. Now, here's where this story gets heartbreaking. For decades after World War II, these women's stories were largely forgotten. The Soviet Union disbanded the 588th Regiment 6 months after the war ended, October 15, 1945, and when they held the massive victory parade in Moscow, the night witches weren't invited. The official reason? Their planes were too slow for the parade, which is just so sad when you think about it. These women flew 23,772 combat sorties. That's individual missions, not total flights. Some pilots flew 800 or more missions during the war. They dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on Nazi targets. They destroyed 17 river crossings, 9 railways, 2 railway stations, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, 176 armored cars, 86 firing positions, and 11 searchlights. They provided crucial air support during the liberation of Crimea, Belarus, Poland, and the final push into Germany itself, and 32 of them died doing it. But their names, their faces, their stories, largely unknown, even in Russia, until the 1980s when the Soviet regime began to crumble and historians started digging through military archives. The 8 women who died on July 31, 1943, were buried in a mass grave in Rusko village, near where they fell. They were posthumously awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, 2nd class, a significant honor, but not the highest. 23 other members of the 588th would eventually receive the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration. But these 8? They became statistics, names in a ledger. Until recently, when researchers and aviation historians started piecing together exactly what happened that night. Let me tell you about them. Yevgenia Krutova was a trained pilot, one of thousands of young Soviet women who joined flying clubs in the 1930s when aviation was seen as this glamorous, modern, forward-thinking career. The Soviet Union encouraged women to fly. It was part of the communist ideology that women were equal to men in all things, including warfare. Krutova had logged hundreds of hours before the war even started. Yelena Salikova, her navigator, was in her early 20s. She'd studied navigation and aeronautical engineering at the Engels School of Aviation, where all three women's regiments trained in late 1941. They were supposed to learn in a few months what normally took years: flight operations, navigation, maintenance, ground crew operations, everything. These women didn't just fly the planes, they repaired them, refueled them, loaded the bombs themselves. Anna Vysotskaya came from a working-class family. She'd applied to join Marina Raskova's aviation regiments in late 1941, after Germany invaded the Soviet Union that June. Raskova, the Soviet Amelia Earhart, a celebrity pilot with multiple long-distance flight records, had received thousands of letters from women begging to join the war effort. Stalin approved the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments as both a military necessity — they needed pilots — and propaganda. Look how progressive we are. Galina Dokutovich had been a flight instructor before the war. She was one of the more experienced navigators in the regiment, someone the younger crews looked up to. She'd been flying combat missions since the summer of 1942. Yevgenia Suhorokova was described by her fellow pilots as cheerful and fearless. She'd grown up during the Russian Revolution and Civil War, a generation that had seen incredible violence and upheaval. For her, flying combat missions was just what you did. You served your country. Alexandra Rogova had joined the 588th alongside Suhorokova. They'd trained together, flown together, died together. Valentina Polunina was the pilot of the 4th aircraft. She was experienced enough to be trusted with combat missions, but not yet a squadron leader. She was still learning. And Glafira Kashirina, she's the one we know the most about. Born in the village of Sergeyevka, she'd moved to Moscow with her mother and worked her way up through the aviation clubs, becoming an instructor. She'd joined the 588th in late 1941, trained through the brutal winter of 1941 to 42, and deployed to the Eastern Front in May 1942. For over a year, she'd been flying night missions. Sometimes 8, 10, 12 runs in a single night. Can you imagine? 10 hours in an open cockpit, freezing temperatures, enemy fire, exhaustion so deep you could barely stand when you climbed out of the plane. And then you had to do it again the next night. The women slept during the day in makeshift quarters, sometimes old school buildings, sometimes just tents near the airfield. They wore men's uniforms that were way too big, boots stuffed with torn bedding to make them fit. Some cut their hair short to look more like men. Others kept theirs long and used navigation pencils as lipstick because they refused to give up their femininity, even in war. They painted flowers on their planes. They kept bouquets of wildflowers in the cockpits. The motto of the 588th was, "You are a woman, and you should be proud of that." So, investigators and historians spent years trying to understand exactly what happened on the night of July 31, 1943. German records were one source. The Luftwaffe kept meticulous documentation of aerial victories, especially ones as significant as Kochiok's 4 kills in one night. Soviet military records were another, though they were harder to access for decades due to Cold War secrecy. But the real breakthrough came from survivor testimonies. Women like Serafima Amosova, who witnessed the massacre. Women like Nadezhda Popova, one of the most decorated night witches, who flew 852 combat missions and survived the war. Women like Yevgenia Jigulenko, who flew close to 1,000 sorties, was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, and later became a film director. She actually directed a 1981 Soviet film called In the Sky of the Night Witches, about her own experiences. These women talked about that night. They described the green flares, the sudden silence of the anti-aircraft guns, the methodical way the German fighter pilot had picked them off, and they talked about what happened after, how they returned to their quarters and saw 8 folding beds still set up, the beds of women who would never come home. "You can imagine our feelings," one survivor said, "when we returned to our quarters and saw 8 beds folded, and we knew they were the beds of our friends who perished a few hours ago." The tactical breakdown reveals just how vulnerable these women were. The PO-2 biplane had exactly 0 defensive capabilities. No guns, no armor, No radio. At least not until late in the war. No parachutes until the summer of 1944, and even then, they often didn't wear them because the weight of the parachute meant you could carry fewer bombs, and the bombs were more important than your own survival. The plane's top speed was 90 miles per hour. It was made of plywood and canvas. A single tracer round could set the whole thing ablaze. Their only advantages were darkness, maneuverability, and the element of surprise. They flew at low altitudes, sometimes just above the treetops, which made them hard to detect. They used a tactic where two planes would deliberately draw fire while a third idled its engine and glided over the target. The sound of wind through the struts was all the warning the Germans got before bombs started falling. But Joseph Kochiok had figured them out. He'd studied their patterns for weeks, maybe months. He knew their approach vectors, their timing, their tactics. And on July 31st, he coordinated with the ground forces to create the perfect ambush. The green flares told him where to attack. The silent anti-aircraft guns gave him a clear field of fire. And his Bf-1110, with its superior firepower and twin-engine stability, gave him the platform he needed to execute 4 perfect kills. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, brilliant. It was also a slaughter. The 588th didn't fly again that night. For the first time since deploying to the front lines in June 1942, they were grounded. Not by mechanical failure, not by weather, but by fear and grief. Think about what that means. These women flew every single night, multiple missions per night, for over a year. They flew in blizzards, in fog, in temperatures that dropped to minus 48 degrees Celsius during the Battle of Stalingrad. Cold so severe that touching the metal parts of the aircraft would rip the skin off your hands. They flew through anti-aircraft fire, through searchlights, through enemy fighter patrols. They kept going even when they were exhausted, even when they were terrified, even when friends died. But July 31st, 1943, broke them. Temporarily. The regiment's commander, Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, held an emergency meeting with her surviving pilots. Bershanskaya was 30 years old, a calm, steady presence who'd led the 588th since its formation. She'd lost her own mentor, Marina Raskova, just 6 months earlier. Raskova died on January 4, 1943, when her PE-2 bomber crashed attempting a forced landing on the Volga River. Stalin gave Raskova the first state funeral of World War II, and her ashes were buried in the Kremlin wall. The loss had devastated the regiment. Now, 6 months later, they'd lost 8 more. Bershanskaya made a decision. They would grieve. They would honor their dead. But they would not stop flying. Because if they stopped, the Germans won. And these women, students, teachers, engineers, mothers, daughters, hadn't volunteered to become combat pilots just to quit when things got hard. The next night, August 1st, 1943, the 588th was back in the air. They changed their tactics. Instead of predictable approach patterns, they varied their routes. Instead of flying in tight formations, they scattered more. They developed new ways to coordinate without radios, visual signals, timing, instinct. They adapted, and they survived. The regiment continued flying until May 4, 1945, just 3 days before Germany's official surrender. Their final mission was within 60 kilometers of Berlin. They'd flown from the Caucasus to the gates of the Third Reich's capital. Now, here's the thing about war. Sometimes the only justice is survival, and the only resolution is memory. Joseph Kochiok, the witch hunter, didn't live to see the end of the war. On the night of September 26, 1943, less than 2 months after killing 8 night witches, he shot down a Soviet DB-3 bomber over Kerch in Crimea. But his Bf-110 collided with the crashing bomber in the darkness. Kochiok and his radio man, Feldwebel Wegerhoff, bailed out. Wegerhoff's parachute opened. Kochiok's didn't. He fell to his death. He was 25 years old, posthumously promoted to lieutenant, probably buried as an unknown soldier in Sevastopol War Cemetery. There's a certain grim irony there. the hunter brought down by his own success. The 8 women, Krutova, Salikova, Vysotskaya, Dokutovich, Suhorukova, Rogova, Polunina, Kashirina, were buried in a mass grave in Rusko village, near where they fell. They were posthumously awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, 2nd class. For decades, their graves went unvisited except by locals who maybe didn't even know who was buried there. But in recent years, something has changed. Historians, aviation enthusiasts, veterans organizations, they've started honoring these women. Memorials have been erected, books have been written, films have been made. The 2015 publication of several books about the Night Witches brought international attention to their story. A 2019 novel, The Huntress, by Kate Quinn, featured a night witch. Character. Gaming communities have created tributes. Metal bands have written songs about them. The women are being remembered. Here's what we know about the broader impact of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They flew 23,672 combat sorties. They dropped over 23,000 tons of and 26,000 incendiary shells on Nazi targets. They destroyed or damaged hundreds of military installations, vehicles, and positions. 23 members of the regiment were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor in the USSR. Out of 89 women who received that title during World War II, 23 were night witches. The regiment had approximately 200 members rotating through during the war. 32 died. That's a 16% casualty rate over 3 years of continuous combat operations. For comparison, some estimates suggest that up to 1/3 of all female Soviet pilots were killed during the war. The Night Witches had a relatively better survival rate, partly because they flew at night, and partly because their planes were so primitive that German fighters struggled to shoot them down. But here's the thing that breaks my heart about this story. After the war, these women were expected to just go back to being housewives and mothers. The Soviet Union disbanded the regiment. They weren't invited to the victory parade. The skills they'd developed, leadership, courage, technical expertise, combat experience, were suddenly worthless in peacetime. The Soviet government wanted women back in traditional roles. Some of the night witches continued flying. Nadezhda Popova became a flight instructor. Yevgenia Zhigulenko studied at the Lenin Military Political Academy, only the second woman to graduate from that school, and later became a film director. But many others faded into obscurity. Their stories weren't told. Their sacrifices weren't honored. Until now.